the powder that was not meant for war. A Taoist workshop, Tang Dynasty, China, c. 850 AD. Master Su had spent the greater part of 30 years searching for the elixir of immortality, when the mixture he was heating over a low charcoal fire, a combination of saltpeter, sulfur, and charred honey, he had prepared according to a formula passed down through 3 generations of alchemists before him, each convinced that some slight refinement of proportion or preparation might finally unlock the substance's supposed life-extending properties, flared suddenly and violently, singeing his eyebrows, blackening the workshop's wooden ceiling beams, and very nearly setting fire to the entire modest structure before his apprentice, a careful and quick-thinking young man named Lin Bao, managed to smother the flames with a heavy cloth. "This is not the elixir of life," Master Su said, once the immediate danger had passed and the 2 men stood surveying the scorched wreckage of what had, until moments earlier, been a carefully organized alchemical workshop. "Whatever we have created here, it is very much the opposite of what we were attempting to find." It was Lin Bao, considerably younger and considerably less invested in the specific alchemical tradition his master had devoted his entire adult life to pursuing, who first suggested, in the days that followed this alarming and clearly unsuccessful experiment, that the substance's violent and unpredictable behavior, whatever its failure as an elixir of immortality, might nonetheless possess a genuine practical value entirely separate from the search that had originally produced it. "Consider what we have actually observed, Master," Lin Bao said, examining the scorched remains of the workshop with the particular careful attention he brought to every problem, whether alchemical or otherwise, that came before him. "This mixture, properly proportioned and properly ignited, releases a very considerable quantity of energy very suddenly, in a manner that no other substance either of us has encountered in all our years of alchemical experimentation behaves anything remotely similar to. I do not believe this represents any failure of our search for the elixir of life, exactly, so much as an accidental discovery of something else entirely, a substance whose actual practical value may lie not in extending life at all, but in some considerably more forceful and considerably more immediately useful application." What the alchemists had actually found. The substance Master Su and Lin Bao had accidentally discovered, a specific proportional combination of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal that would, over the following centuries, come to be known throughout the Chinese historical tradition and eventually, following its own considerably later transmission to other civilizations, throughout the entire world as gunpowder, represented, though neither man could have fully appreciated it at the time, one of the most historically consequential accidental discoveries in the entire history of human technology, emerging not from any deliberate military research effort, but from a considerably older and considerably more spiritually motivated tradition of Taoist alchemical experimentation focused on the pursuit of physical immortality. I want you to understand, a later historian of Chinese alchemical and military technology would eventually write, drawing on the surviving fragments of historical record documenting this general period of discovery, just how genuinely unexpected and genuinely accidental this particular discovery actually was in the context of the broader alchemical tradition from which it emerged. Taoist alchemists of this general period were engaged in a serious, and by the standards of their own intellectual tradition, entirely rigorous program of experimentation, seeking specific substances and specific preparations believed capable of conferring physical immortality, or, at minimum, considerably extended life and health upon those who successfully consumed them. The discovery that a particular combination of substances they had been experimenting with for entirely different purposes instead produced a violent and highly combustible reaction represents, in this specific historical context, a genuinely striking example of what modern historians of science sometimes call a serendipitous discovery, a finding of genuine and ultimately enormous practical significance, arrived at entirely by accident. In the course of research directed toward an entirely different, and, in this particular case, entirely unsuccessful original goal. The slow path from curiosity to weapon. The transformation of this accidentally discovered substance from an alchemical curiosity into an actual military technology proceeded, according to the surviving historical record, considerably more gradually than popular historical imagination sometimes assumes, a process that unfolded across several subsequent wise involving numerous incremental refinements and numerous distinct stages of practical application, before the substance eventually developed into anything resembling the sophisticated military explosive that later historical periods would come to associate with the general category of gunpowder weaponry. The earliest recorded military applications of this substance, a fictional but historically grounded military historian named Professor Jiang Wei might reasonably explain, in a lecture summarizing this general period of technological development for students encountering the subject for the first time, involved not any kind of explosive projectile weapon of the sort that later historical periods would eventually develop, but rather considerably simpler incendiary applications. The substance packed into simple containers and used to create fire and smoke effects during siege warfare, employed to frighten enemy troops and enemy horses through its dramatic and unfamiliar combustive properties, or used to ignite fires against enemy fortifications and enemy siege equipment, applications that drew primarily on the substance's incendiary properties rather than on any genuine explosive or propulsive force in the more modern sense of those terms. It was only across the following several centuries, through a gradual process of experimentation and refinement, that historical records document occurring primarily during the Song Dynasty period, that Chinese military engineers began developing considerably more sophisticated weapons that harnessed the substance's genuine explosive and propulsive potential, rather than merely its incendiary properties. Early grenade-like weapons designed to explode and scatter fragments upon detonation. And in a development of particular historical significance, the earliest documented weapons in the entire history of human warfare capable of using the substance's rapid combustion to actually propel a projectile through a tube, representing the direct conceptual ancestor of every firearm that any subsequent military tradition in any subsequent civilization would eventually go on to develop. The fire lance. It was this specific development, a weapon historians have come to call the fire lance, representing the earliest known ancestor of the firearm in the fullest technical sense of that term, that Professor Jiang would identify in her own broader account of this general period of technological history as the single most historically consequential specific innovation to emerge from this centuries-long process of gradual military refinement. The fire lance, she would explain, consisted in its earliest and most basic form of a bamboo, or in somewhat later and more durable versions, metal tube, packed with gunpowder and typically also containing small projectiles, pellets, pottery shards, or similar small fragments, mounted on the end of a spear or similar polearm, allowing a soldier to ignite the weapon's powder charge and direct the resulting explosive discharge of flame, smoke, and small projectiles directly at an approaching enemy at close range, in a manner that combined elements of what modern readers might recognize as both an incendiary weapon and, in its basic underlying principle of using rapid gunpowder combustion to propel small projectiles through a tube toward a target, an early and genuinely primitive but conceptually authentic ancestor of the firearm. I want to emphasize to any student encountering this history for the first time just how genuinely significant this specific conceptual development actually was, considered within the broader sweep of human military technological history. Every firearm that any subsequent military tradition, in any subsequent civilization across the entire world, would eventually go on to develop, from the earliest and most primitive hand cannons of medieval Europe, through the elaborate flintlock muskets of the early modern period, through the sophisticated breech-loading rifles of the 19th century, up to and including the most technologically advanced firearms of the modern era, represents, at the most fundamental conceptual level, a direct elaboration and refinement of the same basic underlying principle that Chinese military engineers first successfully demonstrated in the fire lance many centuries before any comparable weapon existed anywhere else in the world. The use of rapid gunpowder combustion, confined within a tube, to propel a projectile toward a target with considerably greater force and considerably greater range than any purely mechanical weapon, however sophisticated, could achieve through muscle power alone. What this meant for the art of war tradition. It was in considering the broader implications of this technological development for the existing Chinese strategic and military tradition, the same broader tradition that had, several centuries earlier, produced the strategic writing associated with Sun Tzu, and somewhat later, the recovered treatise of his descendant Sun Bin, that Professor Jiang found herself drawn to a reflection she considered genuinely significant for understanding how the broader Chinese military tradition actually absorbed and integrated this genuinely revolutionary new category of weapon technology. It is worth considering, she would suggest, how a strategic tradition already many centuries old by the time gunpowder weapons first began appearing on Chinese battlefields actually responded to and incorporated this genuinely unprecedented new category of military technology. The existing strategic tradition, as articulated in texts like the Sunzi and the recovered writings of Sun Bin, had developed its core principles: the emphasis on deception, on careful calculation of relative strength, on the avoidance of unnecessary direct confrontation, on the careful management of terrain and logistics during a period when the basic technology of warfare Whatever its own considerable sophistication in areas like standardized weapons manufacturing and complex siege engineering, remained fundamentally limited to muscle-powered weapons. Swords, spears, bows, and the various siege engines that ancient and classical military engineering had developed to attack and defend fortified positions. The introduction of gunpowder weapons, and particularly the eventual development of weapons capable of using gunpowder's explosive force to propel projectiles with considerably greater range, considerably greater penetrating power, and considerably greater destructive effect than any muscle-powered weapon could achieve, represented a genuinely fundamental transformation of the underlying physical realities that any strategic tradition concerned with actual battlefield application would eventually need to account for. What I find genuinely striking, studying the historical record of how Chinese military thought actually developed in the centuries following gunpowder's initial weaponization, is how thoroughly the existing strategic tradition's core principles, the emphasis on deception, on careful calculation, on the strategic management of an enemy's expectations and an enemy's morale, proved remarkably durable and remarkably adaptable across this genuinely fundamental technological transformation. Even as the specific tactical and technical details of how those enduring principles were actually applied on any given battlefield necessarily evolved to account for weapons whose basic underlying physics bore essentially no resemblance to anything the tradition's original authors, writing many centuries before gunpowder's discovery, could possibly have anticipated. A fictional commander's application. To illustrate this broader point about the continuity of underlying strategic principle across a genuinely fundamental technological transformation, we might reasonably imagine, as Professor Jiang herself occasionally did in the more illustrative passages of her own broader historical account, a fictional but historically grounded Song Dynasty military commander. Let us call him General Cao Rong. Tasked with defending a fortified city against a besieging force during the period when gunpowder weapons, including early fire lances and increasingly sophisticated gunpowder-based grenades and incendiary bombs, had become an established, if still developing, component of Chinese military technology. General Cao Rong's actual tactical challenge, we might reasonably imagine based on the general pattern of siege warfare that the historical record documents for this period, would have involved integrating these genuinely novel gunpowder weapons into a broader defensive strategy, still fundamentally organized around the same core strategic principles the Chinese military tradition had developed many centuries earlier. Deceiving the besieging force about the city's actual defensive strength and actual remaining supplies, exploiting the besieging commander's own overconfidence or impatience, carefully managing the psychological as much as the purely physical dimension of the siege's eventual outcome. Consider how a commander in General Cao Rong's imagined position might actually have employed these new weapons, Professor Jiang suggested in her own illustrative account. The fire lance and its associated gunpowder weapons offered a genuinely significant defensive advantage in close combat, particularly during the specific and always dangerous moment when a besieging force attempted to actually scale or breach a defended wall, a moment when defenders employing gunpowder weapons could inflict a degree of sudden, dramatic, and psychologically devastating close-range destruction that considerably exceeded what conventional muscle-powered weapons, however skillfully employed, could typically achieve in the same brief and chaotic tactical circumstance, but a genuinely skilled commander operating within the older, and by this point deeply established strategic tradition, would have understood that this new weapon's actual value lay not merely in its raw destructive capability considered in isolation, but in how that capability could be integrated into the broader strategic management of the siege as a whole, the careful timing of when and how dramatically to reveal the defense's possession of these still relatively novel and still relatively unfamiliar weapons. For maximum psychological effect against a besieging force that might not yet fully understand or fully anticipate their destructive potential, the careful conservation of a necessarily limited gunpowder supply for the specific critical moments when its dramatic and demoralizing effect would matter most to the siege's overall outcome, rather than its indiscriminate use across every minor skirmish the siege might otherwise present opportunity for. This is, I would suggest, precisely the kind of strategic continuity that the broader Chinese military tradition actually demonstrates across this genuinely significant technological transformation. A continued and remarkably consistent emphasis on the psychological and strategic dimension of warfare, the careful management of an enemy's own expectations and an enemy's own morale. Applied with equal sophistication, whether the specific weapons available to any given commander happen to be the muscle-powered swords and bows of the classical period, the Sun Tzu's original author would have known, or the genuinely revolutionary new gunpowder weapons that a commander in General Cao Rong's imagined circumstances would have had available to him many centuries later. The weapon that traveled. It was in the final section of her broader historical account that Professor Jiang turned to what she considered one of the most genuinely significant and genuinely underappreciated aspects of gunpowder's entire historical development. The process, unfolding across several subsequent centuries following its initial Chinese discovery and initial Chinese weaponization, through which knowledge of the substance and its military applications gradually spread beyond China's own borders, eventually reaching and transforming the military traditions of civilizations across the entire Eurasian landmass, and, in due course, the entire world. The precise historical mechanisms through which gunpowder technology actually spread beyond China remain, in certain specific respects, a matter of continued scholarly research and continued scholarly debate, Professor Jiang acknowledged, but the broader historical pattern is reasonably well established. Knowledge of gunpowder and its military applications appears to have spread westward across Asia over the course of the 13th century, likely transmitted through a combination of trade contacts, diplomatic exchange, and during the specific period of the Mongol conquests, the considerable movement of military technology and military technical knowledge that the Mongol Empire's own vast conquests across much of the Eurasian landmass appear to have significantly accelerated. Whether through direct Mongol adoption and subsequent transmission of Chinese gunpowder technology, or through the more general increase in cross-cultural contact and cross-cultural technical exchange that the Mongol Empire's own unprecedented scale of conquest and unprecedented scale of subsequent administrative integration across such a vast territory appears to have generally facilitated. By the early 14th century, historical records document the appearance of gunpowder weapons in European warfare, initially in forms that closely parallel the earlier stages of Chinese gunpowder weapon development, incendiary applications, and early, relatively primitive cannon designs, before European military engineers, over the following several centuries, developed their own increasingly sophisticated refinements of the basic underlying technology, eventually producing the considerably more advanced firearms and artillery systems that would come to define European warfare, and eventually, through European colonial and military expansion, warfare across essentially the entire world by the early modern period. I want to emphasize, to any reader encountering this broader historical pattern for the first time, how genuinely significant it is that a technology first discovered entirely by accident, in the course of a Taoist alchemical tradition pursuing an entirely different, and in the specific goal of achieving physical immortality, entirely unsuccessful original purpose, would go on, across the following many centuries of subsequent historical development and subsequent global transmission, to become perhaps the single most consequential military technology in the entire subsequent history of human warfare, fundamentally reshaping not merely the specific tactics and specific weapons of every subsequent military tradition across the entire world, but the broader political, social, and economic structures of essentially every subsequent civilization whose own historical development this genuinely transformative technology eventually came to touch. What the alchemists never intended. It is worth returning, in concluding this account, to the specific and genuinely poignant historical irony embedded in gunpowder's original discovery, a substance first sought by generations of Taoist alchemists working within a serious and genuinely sophisticated intellectual tradition, in pursuit of extending and preserving human life, that would go on, across the many subsequent centuries of its actual historical development and actual historical application, to become instead one of the most historically significant instruments of human death and human destruction that any civilization, in the entire subsequent history of the world, would ever develop. I do not believe Master Su, or any of the generations of Taoist alchemists whose patient and genuinely serious experimentation eventually produced this substance, could possibly have anticipated the full and genuinely staggering scope of what their accidental discovery would eventually become, Professor Jiang reflected in the concluding passage of her own broader historical account. They were engaged, by every indication the surviving historical record actually provides, in a genuinely sincere and genuinely serious intellectual and spiritual pursuit, the search for a substance capable of extending and preserving human life, understood within their own intellectual tradition as one of the most important and most worthwhile pursuits to which a serious scholar might devote an entire working lifetime. That this same patient search, in the course of its own inevitable trial and inevitable error, would produce instead a substance that later generations of considerably less philosophically motivated military engineers would go on to refine into an instrument of warfare responsible, across the many subsequent centuries of its actual historical use, for an amount of human death and human suffering that no single individual account could ever hope to fully or adequately measure, represents. I believe one of the more genuinely striking and genuinely instructive ironies in the entire history of human technological development. I would suggest in closing that this particular historical irony offers a broader lesson considerably more significant than the specific technical history of gunpowder's own development. However genuinely fascinating that specific technical history undoubtedly is on its own terms. It reminds us, I believe, that the ultimate application and ultimate consequence of any given technological discovery is very often entirely and completely disconnected from whatever original purpose or original intention actually motivated the specific research or specific experimentation that first produced it, that a substance sought in the sincere pursuit of extending human life can become. Through a historical process that no single individual discoverer could ever have fully anticipated or fully controlled, one of history's most significant instruments of human death instead, and that this same basic pattern, in one form or another, has likely repeated itself across the many centuries and many civilizations of human technological history since gunpowder's own original accidental discovery, considerably more often than most of us. Considering any single specific technological innovation in isolation, are generally inclined to fully appreciate. A note on what actually happened. Gunpowder was discovered in China, most likely during the Tang Dynasty period, through the experimentation of Taoist alchemists engaged in a documented and serious historical tradition of research, aimed at discovering substances believed capable of extending human life or conferring physical immortality. Surviving historical texts from this period explicitly warn of the substance's dangerous, unpredictable combustive properties, indicating that its explosive potential was discovered accidentally in the course of this alchemical research, rather than through any deliberate military development effort. Chinese military engineers subsequently developed gunpowder's practical applications gradually across the following centuries, progressing from early incendiary uses in siege warfare through to genuinely explosive weapons, and eventually, during the Song Dynasty period, weapons including the fire lance, widely recognized by historians of military technology as the direct conceptual ancestor of all subsequent firearms. Using confined gunpowder combustion to propel projectiles through a tube toward a target, knowledge of gunpowder technology gradually spread westward across Asia over the following centuries, likely facilitated in significant part by the extensive cross-cultural contact that accompanied the Mongol conquests, reaching Europe. By the early 14th century, where European military engineers subsequently developed their own increasingly sophisticated refinements of the underlying technology. Historians of technology and warfare generally regard this development, a substance discovered accidentally in the pursuit of human longevity and immortality, eventually becoming one of the most consequential instruments of warfare and human death in world history, as one of the more historically significant examples of an important technology's actual application and actual historical consequence diverging entirely from the original purpose that first motivated its discovery. The specific characters of Master Su, Lin Bao, Professor Jiang Wei, and General Cao Rong are fictional narrative devices created for this account. but the broader historical facts regarding gunpowder's alchemical origins, its gradual weaponization across the Tang and Song dynasty periods, and its subsequent global transmission and historical significance are drawn from established historical scholarship.